in order to establish sustainable livelihoods for populations within regions that are prone to or recovering from conflict. Finance mechanisms that involve both private and public sectors are needed. In our third CGIAR Climate Security webinar series, the panelists discussed the mechanisms and actions needed to leverage sustainable finance for peace.
There's currently a $2.5 trillion gap and for financing the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the question is, how do you make up that gap? And it's the private sector that operates at the trillions of dollars scale.
Official development assistance is looking increasingly to private capital to come in and partner, yet it still plays such a precious role, particularly when it comes to climate security and peace building, because it's a role, particularly in the areas of humanitarian assistance, relief, where grants are still the most precious and has to be used, to Aditi's point, in the most catalytic way as a resource against such great needs.
There's really a substantial private sector activity that can be stimulated, particularly in the area of the operation and maintenance of the early warning systems and the forecasting instrumentation, but also in terms of providing insurance products.
So the innovative financial structures, if not all, they always have a wide range of factors involved that come from completely different backgrounds and that are different stakeholders. So I think we need to look at much more collaboration across partners.
Trying to co-create initiatives with the different players and actors is the only way to get to something that is effective in terms of the beneficiaries, in terms of the donors, in terms of the investors.
Hello, welcome everyone to this webinar on climate security in the Sahel. My name is Rachel McDonnell and I am the Strategic Programme Director for Water, Climate Change and Resilience at the International Water Management Institute, which is part of the CGIAR. We are delighted you could join us today, and as we further explore ideas and share insights on the challenges and issues around climate security. Climate change and variability continue to bring shocks and stresses to communities everywhere, including impacts on water and food security, increasingly undermining development advances made in far too many geographies. You only need to see the coverage of droughts and floods from news outlets to see the devastation these extreme events bring. Those impacts are particularly pronounced where environmental societies are already fragile, with hunger and thirst compounding existing challenges. The growing thinking on climate security is that climate change does not necessarily cause increased tensions, instability, or conflict, but exposes and compounds risks that already exist. These risks arise from many social, political, economic, and environmental challenges, including from inequality in its many forms, poor access to opportunities, persecution, or inherent fragility in geopolitical systems. Climate variability linked to environmental degradation can leave people struggling for control of a decreasing and finite pool of natural resources such as land and water. Ensuring water and food security then become part of the ongoing area of tension and conflict. When it comes to existing conflict situations, climate stresses might prolong the violence, inhibit peacekeepers and peace-building processes, and further stress weak governance, increasing the human costs of war. It's no wonder climate security is now a growing focus of diplomats, the military, businesses, civil society, as well as researchers. And it's really important we break down silos in our thinking in this critical area as we tackle these incredibly complex and intertwined challenges that lead to conflict and instability. The need to work together has never been greater. We know that food, land, and water systems are at the heart of peace, and without peace, there is no end to hunger or thirst. The CGIAR's Climate Security Initiative is bringing its unparalleled strength and depth of knowledge of food and water systems and our regional engagement to thinking around climate security. This webinar today is the fourth in the current series, with previous events focusing on food security, on food systems, on data, and finance, setting out a range of ideas and thinking in these areas. The podcasts and YouTube of these seminars have now been downloaded or viewed more than 20,000 times, highlighting just how much this is becoming a critical area of thinking. Today's event will take a regional focus, and we're looking at the Sahel, an area unfortunately not new to instability and conflict, and where the impacts of climate stresses are all too common. We'll begin by first showing a short video that summarizes the scope of the 6 webinars in this series. Thank you.
Debates continue to take place on whether and to what extent climate plays a role in exacerbating conflicts. Outside of these debates, the complex interactions and feedback loops between climate and conflict are a major threat to livelihoods, affecting millions as we speak. This is likely to worsen in the future. Climate change is a reality, and its effects will be profound at a global scale. Understanding and addressing these complex interactions between climate and conflict is likely one of the keys to achieving long-lasting peace. Until now, we have not addressed conflicts with a climate-smart approach and the urgency the matter deserves. Climate and conflict experts have much to improve in how they collaborate and exchange with each other. Finding common ground among the different perspectives is crucial. The way to address the complex connections between climate, conflict and peace is to adopt a systemic perspective towards food systems and natural resources, focusing on the key interactions for science and policy making that are central to long-lasting peace. We invite you to join our CGIAR Climate Security webinar series with live and interactive sessions connecting science and policy in the context of climate security and conflict. Our goal is to highlight the importance of developing sustainable food systems and natural resource management as a foundation for long-lasting peace.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I am the editor of the UN and Global Affairs website UN Dispatch and host of the Global Dispatches podcast. Today's conversation about climate security in the Sahel will be recorded as a live taping of the podcast, and I am proud to serve as your moderator today. The Sahel is routinely cited by the UN as one of the regions in the world most vulnerable to climate change. Many of the trends in this region, more than anywhere else, are felt more acutely by people when it comes to climate change. It is also a region with some profound security challenges, including political instability, armed conflict and insurgencies, extreme poverty, and high levels of food insecurity. The international community has long sought to support peace and security in this region, but the results have been mixed. One of the UN's larger peacekeeping missions is currently deployed to Mali, and France is supporting a 5-country counterterrorism force known as the G5 Sahel. Yet despite these efforts, security conditions in the region remain extremely tenuous. According to the OECD, with the exception of Senegal, every country in this region is considered either fragile or extremely fragile. In today's conversation, we are going to try to bridge conversations and discussions about climate and security in the Sahel that happen too often independent of each other. We are going to tackle questions around climate and security by drawing on perspectives of experts who do not always find themselves in the same room. Now, the goal here is that by connecting experts working on climate change, food systems, and security, we can potentially bring some new ideas to the table and perhaps chart some innovative solutions to the myriad of challenges facing this region. And to that end, I am pleased to introduce our panel today. Her Excellency, Ms. Rigmor Elien Koti, is Norway's Special Representative for the Sahel. Welcome. Dr. Robert Zugmore is the Africa Program Leader, CGIAR Research Program on Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security. Welcome, Robert. Dr. Bruno Charbonneau is the Director Centre Franco-Pay in Conflict Resolution and Peace Mission and Professor of International Studies at the Royal Military College in Canada. Welcome. Dr. Catherine Loon Grayson is a Senior Policy Advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross. Welcome. Ornella Morin is Head of the Sahel Program at the Institute for Security Studies. And before we dive into this discussion, I do want to note that a version of this conversation will be available with French subtitles. So with that, let us dive into the conversation. And Ornella, my first question goes to you because I'd like you to set the security context for this region. To the extent that many conflicts in the region are driven primarily by local concerns or local grievances, is there anything common throughout the region that connects these conflicts? Another way to think of this, do conflicts in the region share similar characteristics?
Well, in fact, the answer to that would be yes. So, of course, it's very important to look at the various conflicts that affect the Sahel region for their specificity at a local level. But beyond that, there's a number of common trends. First of them is, I think, the centrality of local conflicts related to land and natural resources throughout various governance systems, geographies, and social groups. This isn't any news, really, but it's quite counterintuitive to the global media focus on larger scale challenges, such as the presence of terrorist groups, for instance. In fact, the overwhelming majority of conflicts in the Sahel region arise locally, and the failure to settle them peacefully at a local level leads to escalation and to violence. This is also the failure of state justice systems to handle local conflicts, leading to consequences in terms of providing nurturing ground for violent extremist groups to be able to convince these affected communities that they would do a better job than the state in delivering justice and defending the interests of local communities. And another important aspect, I believe, is that the Sahel communities are increasingly confronted with the scarcity of these resources due to climate change and demographic pressure, the coexistence of parallel and often competing land tenure and natural resource management systems, as well as weak presence of the states. All these contribute to worsening what's already fragile local context, setting the stage for redundant and recurrent conflicts. In the central part of Mali, if I may take this particular example, high levels of competitions and widespread communal violence since 2017 have led to a tendency to essentialize along ethnic lines what really are actually traditional forms of competition between various groups, be them farmers, herders, fishers, in order to access to local resources. So this makes local conflict harder to solve because, of course, while it's possible to negotiate resources, it is much less so to negotiate identities. There are also common trends in the nature of the local grievances behind this conflict. You mentioned some of these in your introductory remarks, Mark. The lack of access to basic local services such as health, education, markets, infrastructure, insufficient access to the justice system, which is perceived as physically distant, often with premises only in the regional capital or in far away main towns, culturally inaccessible, operating in French, and with some kind of esoteric procedures, and mainly just corrupt. These grievances are quite a common trend across Sahel regions, actually. While perhaps just one last thing on my side. To finish, I'd just like to say a word about the ever worsening humanitarian situation in the region, which is also an important element to understand the security context, especially in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, but also in bordering parts of neighboring Nigeria, for instance. Mali is a good example, with no less than 2.9 million people, which is over half of the country's population, affected by the humanitarian crisis by mid-2020, according to the UN Agency for Humanitarian Coordination. This is more than half of Mali's population. Out of this number, a third of Mali's population is now indeed in need of food assistance to meet basic needs. So
I should say we will get to Dr. Catherine Lund-Grayson from the ICRC, who can provide a little more context and nuance to those important figures that you cited. But that was a very helpful, I think, sketch of the current security challenges facing the region. And now I'd like to turn to Robert Zugmore to sketch out some of the climate change and climate variability implications in the region. Can you just describe, give a sense of the key ways that climate variability is impacting people's lives and ways that can make them potentially more vulnerable? And what does science tell us about the impact of climate change on the lives and livelihoods of people in the region?
Thank you very much, Mark. Not to repeat the previous speakers, I think it is well known that climate change, and mostly climate variability, has been and is impacting already all sectors of human life, and of course of the Sahel region, which is a particularly well-known region as climate vulnerability hotspots, and that's the key word. And the population have been experiencing several climate extremes with dramatic consequences. I will just highlight few of them as an impact of climate variability. We know, for instance, that in terms of science, models are talking differently, to speak in an easy way. Climate model I'm mentioning. But there is a consensus on the overall climate impact on rainfall, which is declining already, especially on the West Sahel. There is also an increase in temperature, and it is even expected that by the end of this century, we will maybe experience, in the worst scenario, something like 3 to 4 degree increase. And in terms of a trend in extremes, there is a general increase in the intensity of high rainfalls. And all these translate into, in concrete terms, to more severe droughts and increased frequency of these droughts. And we are already seeing some of these things happening in those Sahelian countries. Severe flooding events, and I think nowadays Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali are also experiencing some flooding, which are really endangering lives of many populations. And we sometimes also forget the effect of extreme temperatures. This is important for cropping, for some crops, but also for human being health. And so these climate shocks lead to additional threat to population lives and livelihood. And I just want to mention 3 examples. For instance, on food security, there is a yield reduction that is expected as a consequence of climate variability. This is what science is saying. Reduced pasture and loss of livestock with degradation of the nutrition, the loss of the productive assets. For instance, the locust invasion is bringing some difficult economic situation to vulnerable population. So all these potentially are exacerbating, I would say, the tension and conflict around the limited natural resources. On human health, of course, the resurgence of outbreaks and of pests and diseases linked, for instance, to flooding. So malaria, dengue are some kind of diseases. And to finish, there are also some side effects of the climate variability in terms of loss of economic power, the decrease in terms of resilience of the population, and many others. But I will just stop here for the time being.
Thank you, Robert. And to you, Dr. Catherine Loon Grayson of the ICRC, Ornella at the beginning, cited some important figures around the humanitarian situation in the region, and Robert just discussed some of the human impacts of climate change. Can you just give us a ground's eye view of how people are impacted by insecurity in the region and how they're coping? What are the humanitarian and social implications of endemic insecurity and climate variability in this region?
So the implications are dramatic, and Ornella already alluded to some quite telling figures. Here are a few more. 1 million of people are internally displaced. Nearly 2 million people are in a situation of food crisis, and that includes nearly 400,000 children that are acutely malnourished. We see that the implications affect all dimensions of people's lives, from their safety to their health, to their livelihoods, to their access to food, water, or to their economic security. And this, in a number of cases, leads to displacement. We're seeing that these problems feed into one another and further exacerbate people's vulnerability. If I can take an example of how climate risks and conflict interact to create further vulnerability from northern Mali, I think that will help explaining what we're seeing. So in northern Mali, in the face of a bad season, herders will normally travel longer distances with their herds to find grazing land and water. Some family members may move to search for work, and the state or humanitarian organizations may be able to provide some assistance. Now, when armed conflict and insecurity are added to the equation, people's usual ways of coping are hindered. Herders are no longer able to travel long distances with their cattle because of the insecurity. The state's capacity to assist is limited, and the insecurity also limits humanitarian access. So we see that herders are forced to concentrate around water points. Some end up selling their livestock at discounted prices as they cannot move to faraway markets to sell their animals. And some who have lost everything end up moving to urban centers or moving further south to greener areas. So what we see there is an already poor population that is becoming even poorer. What's at stake? People's livelihoods, people's safety. And this limits their access to food, which affects their access to health services, and so on and so forth. So we have a spiral that is extremely negative there. We also see that the implications can be far-reaching. Along with other megatrends, so we can think here of urbanization or demographic growth, we see that the implications of combined climate risks and conflict can shape human mobility or access to resources on a continental scale. So for instance, we're seeing that changes to the Sahelian climate and the environment combined with insecurity in the Sahel is having an impact hundreds of kilometers away in the Central African Republic by altering the patterns of transhumance of herders. Turning to how people cope, adapting to climate change can be relatively simple. It may require a simple change in crops, for instance, but in most cases, it requires major changes. So a whole agricultural system might need to change, or new diseases might need to be dealt with. Ambitious, concerted, and long-term efforts tend to be rather limited in times of war, as authorities are not only weak, but also preoccupied with security priorities. In the absence of adequate support, people try to cope by changing or diversifying livelihoods, by adapting their way of life, or ultimately moving away from their homes. Although we see that the poorest and the most vulnerable, in a number of cases, will be trapped in place. So what we see in northern Mali, for instance, is that some move to nearby urban areas, but livelihood opportunities are fairly limited in such settings. Other moved further south, as I was mentioning, and in some cases, this is creating tensions and putting pressure on resources And tensions stem from the fact that communities that usually live at a distance suddenly have to find ways to coexist. We also see that young men who would normally be moving to find some work may not be able to move because of the insecurity. So in short, people cope, but those who are poor tend to become poorer and they experience greater precarity.
Thank you. Bruno Charbonneau, I'd like to turn to you now. You know, in just the first few minutes of this conversation, I've heard a far more nuanced and textured conversation and definition of what security means in this region than what I'm accustomed to reading in Western media outlets, or even what I'm accustomed to hearing from experts that I interview who tend to define security in this region strictly in military terms. So I'm curious to learn from you, what linkages do you see between the situation in the Sahel today and how discussions about fragility in this region tend to be just framed around the military solutions and military terms?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Well, if we are to discuss climate security in Sahel, I think we need to keep at least two things in mind. First one is that the Sahel is an imprecise and fuzzy region, politically indeterminate. No one agrees on its boundaries, where it begins and where it ends exactly. So states and international organizations develop and promote their strategy for the Sahel, but it is that strategy that usually defines the boundaries of the Sahel. So this points to actually regional politics. That is, a struggles over who defines borders and boundaries of regional space, its identity, meaning, and function. The immediate policy relevance of this can be observed in the creation of G5 Sahel organization in 2014. In West Africa, ECOWAS is considered the most advanced African organization in the field of security. And yet the European Union, member states, African partners, international donors funded and helped create that G5 Sahel organization. To me, that was an obvious attempt at restricting who gets to define what security is, whose security is prioritized, and so on and so forth. This brings me to my second point. We still live, as far as I'm concerned, in a post-9/11 world. So the climate security nexus was popularized in 2003 with the release of two strategy documents, one from the Pentagon, the other one from the European Council. It gained momentum, the idea, in 2007 when Al Gore IPCC were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But I would also point out the 2007 CNA Corporation report that was signed by dozens of top US generals. And in the document, they make clear links between climate conflict and terrorism and what it means for US national security and global security in general. And their logic is fairly straightforward. If states collapse or fail due to climate change, the conditions will be ripe for the rise of extremist and terrorist groups. This is not causal logic per se, but climate change here is conceived as a threat multiplier that creates the conditions for that sort of insurgency. And you can see even today that the UN Security Council discusses climate security in such terms. And I would point you to the 2007 resolution on Chad as a demonstration or example of that. So this is a context, I think, that we need to keep in mind to answer your question, Mark. So to bring it back to today's situation, international military cooperation were deployed in 2013 and are still operating within this mindset that the French-led operations contribute to the global war on terror. So in 2020, Western actors still operate under that premise that you need to wage that war on terror first in order to then guarantee the space for politics, the time and space for the peace process in Mali, for instance, time and space to do development throughout the Sahel. So just to give you another example, despite the 18th August coup d'etat in Mali, French President Macron asked for a quick return to constitutional order so that everyone could go back to fighting terrorists. And the European Union in that context is very explicit about its primary objective. It is to manage the effects of those conflicts in the Sahel in order to contain the flows of illicit migration and goods that might go to Europe. So basically, in short, given that the Sahel is malleable as a space of intervention, you can define it, or you can define the intervention you want according to your understanding of the Sahel and the threats that you associate with that space. In security and military circles these days, a dominant understanding of the Sahel is one of a non-governed space that emphasizes the threat of terrorist groups. And so I think, to conclude, the key question brings us to the debate about the impact and influence on the global war and terror agenda, on the UN, on UN structures and agencies, and how counter-terrorist practices affect efforts to address climate-related security risk and activities.
Well, thank you. And I think that is a nice lead up to our next speaker, Madame Coty. Norway has been heavily invested in peace and development in the Sahel, not just on the security side, as Bruno just alluded to. And soon, though, Norway will have a seat on the Security Council, from which it can further advance this more holistic understanding of security in the region. So can you just, for now, describe how Norway has integrated climate security into its diplomatic and strategic approach to this region?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Yes, that's correct. I actually just came from giving a brief to Norwegian police, who will be deployed to MINUSMA civilian police unit as part of Norway's contribution to the peacekeeping operation in Mali. But the Norwegian engagement in the Sahel started nearly 40 years ago. The extreme drought in the wider Sahel region and images of starving children called for a coordinated response. And Norway at the time established what we call the Sahel Sudan Ethiopia program that was initiated already in 1985. So that provided a combination of research and assistance to the region with the aim to reduce and prevent famine, poverty and conflict. Norwegian research institutions, NGOs and the multilateral system worked closely together with the affected countries to increase food production and improve food security. In many ways, the Norwegian engagement in the Sahel actually started because we clearly saw the dramatic effects of climate change that it had on the population. And in the continuation, climate, sustainable resource management, and its link to conflict prevention has been a main objective for our efforts. And as you can see in our Sahel strategy, projects related to climate, food security, climate resilient agriculture, and conflict prevention are all priorities in our development programs in Mali and Niger. We have also seen the need to address the nexus between humanitarian assistance and development. For instance, when we organized the first humanitarian conference on the Lake Chad region in Oslo in 2017. This is a focus on a more general level, also in our humanitarian strategy. And the Norwegian Action Plan on Sustainable Food Systems, there is a recognition that climate-related security risks are shaping the security and development in many countries, such as the Lake Chad and the Sahel regions. As the previous speakers have said, the Sahel region is considered to be one of the most fragile environments in Africa. And knowing that population growth in the Sahel is expected to increase dramatically, that the temperatures are expected to increase more than the global average, and that the majority of the population live in rural areas, it is very likely that the pressure on the natural resources will become even more problematic.
Can I just ask, when you were briefing the Norwegian police officers who are about to be deployed to the UN peacekeeping mission to Mali, did you bring up climate issues at all, or did they ask about climate issues and their relationship with security?
We brought it up in a more general level when we discussed and explained what Norway is actually doing in the Sahel. So we didn't have a particular focus on climate and security, but it was linked to the rest of our work in the region.
Thank you.
Could I just add a few more things before you give the floor to someone else? Yeah, I just wanted to say that what we see, of course, is that discussing the subjects as we are doing now is very important. And we see that it is even more important to address this with national governments and the regional organizations, in addition to the UN and the AU. And one of the last events that Norway actually co-organized before the COVID-19 pandemic stopped us from organizing international meetings and traveling was a seminar in Dakar, where we put people together from African and Nordic countries, from the multilateral agencies and researchers to see how multilateral cooperation better could work on the issue of climate and security. And we used Sahel as the example. So the recommendations from that workshop or seminar is something that is useful for Norway when we enter the Security Council, as we know that there are some members that do not agree to bring this subject up on the agenda of the Security Council. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you interjected that last point, because it leads perfectly to my next question for Ornella. Can you, in a way similar to what Ms. Coty just described, can you map out what institutions out there, perhaps the African Union or the UN or ECOWAS or countries in the region, should be doing to better integrate a more multi-dimensional solution to the security challenges in the region? So are there, for example, any concrete proposals out there for mechanisms or structures that could integrate climate science into security decisions? What exists out there to help us move this conversation forward?
So I guess to answer your first question, which is what needs to happen, I think a shift in paradigm needs to happen, really. As many of my co-panelists mentioned, right now, the way we are addressing insecurity in the Sahel focuses on the military aspect of it, on the counter-terrorism aspect of it, on boots on the ground, really. While this is an important aspect, it's absolutely not sufficient. And what's needed, as we see, is a shift towards a much more human-centered approach. There is a need to start working not just with a military framing, but in fact with a human security type of framework that would allow us to address the multidimensional nature of the factors that are affecting people's security in the Sahel. And in this context, then, climate security obviously becomes a relevant element, even to put on the table of the Security Council. So there is, in theory, some kind of agreement about that. So you will rarely hear international partners or actors frontally just oppose this idea, but the challenge is to move from speeches really to practice. And this is where the shift is very hard to see. So we have a wealth of policies that talk about integration, that talk about nexuses, that talk about how we should be looking at the bigger picture, but really this does not translate into practice. There are a few examples of good ideas, but that are still at a very local level, either supported by specific NGOs or things like that. But there is still, and I think the ambassador just mentioned that quite well, a lack of political uptake by states, by supranational organizations, to make sure that actually we work with a human security framework and not just with a military one.
So that leads my question to Bruno. Bruno, I have to imagine in your position, you often brief policymakers on security issues in the region. What arguments do you see help support that kind of lack of, or help push against the lack of political uptake, as Ornella just described, in terms of a more broadened definition of security in the region? So what arguments do you make when you're briefing policymakers about why we need to embed climate security and food security paradigms into broader security discussions in the region?
Yeah. if we talk about climate security, I think really the key issue is about conflict prevention. It's about preventing conflict in many ways. If it is about solving current security issues and whatnot, the challenge is temporal here. I mean, the time frame, in other words, is much different. Climate change is something that is happening, obviously, but it needs a policy response over decades and whatnot, and not on current matters. And usually a security community and a community, pardon me, or if you look at UN Security Council, they work in the short term, so they react. They're not very good at prevention. They don't think in that sort of long term. And to go back maybe to UN Security Council, I mean, there's no, despite the fact that they talk about climate change more and more so, there's absolutely no consensus on whether, and I mean, the Germans tried, and maybe our friend from Norway will try as well, but there's no consensus that the Security Council should work on climate change, or that it needs to even consider that sort of thing, or that it's part of its mandate. So even that work needs to be done. And like I said, it needs to be tied back, I think, to the issue of prevention and what that actually means. And the international peace and security architecture in the past and currently has been very bad at doing that.
And so I wanted to turn to Catherine Loon. So Ornella used a phrase that I think is useful. She says that a lot of these conversations that have broad agreements about the need to integrate security and climate issues don't necessarily translate into practice. So what I wanted to ask you is, what do you need on the ground to ensure that this broadened perspective on climate security is harnessed, one, to prevent conflicts in ways that Bruno just alluded to, and also how do we ensure that redefined, broadened notions of security are actually put into practice in a way that improves people's lives?
So on the conflict prevention side of things, I'm not in a very good position to comment, because we're actually there to respond to humanitarian needs, and we're looking at prevention when it comes to preventing exposure to the impacts of natural disasters, for instance. But we're not very much looking into how do we prevent conflict, because we don't see this as part of our role. We see this as critical, as part of a much broader discussion, but this is not necessarily where we put our focus. In terms of how does a greater understanding of, or an understanding of security as a broader question than hard security, but human security, and how does that feed into our work? I mean, I cannot agree more with Ornella that we need to be having this discussion with an understanding of security that goes beyond military security. And that is an understanding of security as capturing food security and water security and so on and so forth. So human security. And this is the basis for our work. I mean, the way humanitarian actors try to respond is through looking at how do we ensure that people can survive, and I would not say strive, because that would be very optimistic, but can survive, which entails that they are safe in all ways that can be discussed here. It's very clear to us that it requires a coordinated effort among a large number of actors. The humanitarian response is a very narrow part of that response. I mean, you do need a hard security as part of this response. I mean, people need to live in safety if we want them to be able to be secure as a whole. But then we also need to be looking into much broader developmental responses that we are not able to deliver, but that are essential if we want to be looking into longer term security. I mean, if we're speaking of what we're talking about here is climate adaptation, so people can live safely. Climate adaptation requires development. It requires that people have access to infrastructure and to energy and so on and so forth. So, I mean, you're basically looking at how do you set the foundations for people to be able to live in safety and in dignity, and that requires a coordinated effort. So, I mean, to come back to your question, what does that mean for us? I mean, broad human security considerations are the prism through which our work can be defined, but with the full recognition that it has to be a collective work. It cannot be the sole work of humanitarian actors, because we cannot ensure that that the responses are at the scale that's required to ensure that people can live safely and in full dignity.
Thank you. And now to Robert, can you describe what CGIAR has already done to contribute to the scientific understanding of the impact of climate change on people in the region? And what kinds of climate science research would be useful to move the discussion forward on this topic of climate security in the Sahel?
Thanks, Mark. There are a number of international agricultural research centers in the Sahel region. For instance, ICRISAT, focusing on semi-arid areas, IMI on water, ILRI on livestock, ICRAF on agroforestry, and so on and so forth. And these centers have been conducting some sort of tremendous research and development activities to generate scientific knowledge that is really aiming to support, I would say, the kind of regional and national stakeholders, as well as communities, to make science-informed decisions for adaptive measures. And like Catherine said, it is important to really work with all the different stakeholders, from regional to national to community level, in order to provide the evidence-based information that will allow these actors to mainstream climate change and variability into their respective strategies, policies, and development agenda. And so the CGIAR has been working closely with a number of partners from regional level like ECOWAS, but also with climate centers like AgriMed, other research network, CORAF, and the National Agricultural Research Institution, in order to generate a certain number of scientific and technical information of relevance to really improving the adaptive capacity of actors. I can give you examples. For instance, the projections of climate and the impact on livelihood. There are a lot of studies by IFPRI, climate risk profile and vulnerability studies, the synthesis and inventory of adaptive options that can be considered, for instance, for the national adaptation planning or the nationally determined contribution of countries. And as a good example, we are also working with communities through what we call the climate smart villages, where we work in a participatory manner in order to generate context-specific technologies that will enable communities to valorize what exists in terms of resources, water, land, livestock, etc., in order to sustain the livelihood in a difficult environment. Of course, we are also capacitating the capacity of all the stakeholders with the knowledge that I mentioned. But moving forward, I would see 2 or 3 important points in terms of agenda where the CGIAR can invest more. For instance, the nexus between climate and security, I think people mentioned it, need to be better investigated for a better understanding of what are the factors that are in play. For instance, migration dynamic can modify or exacerbate the different climatic factors. And these have some connections with conflict. Another example is, for instance, the development of models or mechanisms for managing the tension and conflict around resources. I think this is an important area where research can also invest. And like I said, the last point is that it is really important to work with communities, because this is where we can generate the evidence of what works under which condition, and then inform the upper level policies, strategies for really mitigating conflicts. Thanks.
Thank you. And to Madam Coty, picking up on Robert's points about the need to mainstream these kind of diverse perspectives from different fields of science and security, how can we, in a more systematic way, make sure that these diverse voices are integrated in conversations and key discussions about security issues in the region? I mean, how do you create a platform in which these linkages can be made and brought before the international community so that the international community and local governments and WEL can think through these issues in a more holistic way?
Thank you. That's a big and important question. I think there is already quite a lot of work being done, as some of the other panelists have alluded to. There is a lot of research that is going on, and some institutions also work quite closely with diplomats or national institutions in countries affected. I think at least, again, thinking about us as a Security Council member in a few months, we think it is very necessary for the UN member states to have access to reliable and comprehensive information. And of course, if the Secretary General of the UN is briefing the member states and briefing the Security Council, that is an important voice to show why climate change and security is an important issue. We also see that our Swedish friends have strengthened the capacity of the UN system to this end, and we of course would like to continue and work along those lines and bringing good analysis and also expecting research institutions to provide clear recommendations for action to the Security Council. And of course, we need to bring this into action, and thinking again about the UN bringing climate change and security more explicitly into the mandates of UN operations could be one way of doing it, and also, as I say, having good conversations with the countries in question, but also the regions, as we are now talking about the Sahel and the Lake Chad, that are regions affected by these issues.
Thank you. So we just have a few minutes left, and I want to give everyone an opportunity to make some very brief concluding remarks. Please keep your remarks to about a minute. And I will turn to Ornella, who has spoken about broad issues regarding security and climate in the region. And I'd actually like you in your concluding remarks just to ground this for us. In what ways does security prevention, does conflict prevention and climate security interact with each other?
So I think many of my colleagues here have mentioned this interaction in terms of the need to look at the various ways in which, well, when we don't address issues around scarce resources and the way they're managed, then this leads to conflict and this needs to be addressed. But I think actually that there's much more to the connection between climate and security than the prevention part. There is a reaction and an immediate and strategic dimension to it around the issue of protection of civilians. And again, Mali is a great case study for this. Just this year, just from the beginning of this year, there's been already over 130 village attacks in the central region of Mopti only in Mali, leaving something close to 2,000 fatalities across the country. At an overwhelming majority, these villagers who were attacked either lost their cattle or had it stolen, sometimes burnt alive for hunters, or if they were farmers, then they had to flee from their fields and have been unable to cultivate. So of course, this raises enormous risks for food security and economic recovery in the region. But this goes way beyond the individuals who personally experience these attacks. It also affects the million of people down the line who live from their production. And the fact that we're not addressing these environmental dimensions of the crisis, but also the additional fragility and uncertainty that climate variability creates in this context, of course, keeps making our response slower and less efficient. So I do think that there are a few very strategic points to make if we want to bring this conversation at a higher level.
Thank you very much. And to that end, Bruno, how in the last in just 1 minute, can you describe 1 or 2 action items you would like to see taken to advance this conversation forward?
Well, I agree with what Robert said in particular, which is that we're not quite clear yet what it means to talk and do climate security. It is a huge conceptual, practical, even philosophical challenge. And so we need to think outside the box in many ways, because personally, I think that if we talk about protection of civilians, if we talk about reacting to concrete or immediate effects of climate on conflict, we're not solving anything. We're just reacting, and we're just doing this sort of thing that the peace and security architecture has always done. So I still think that we need to move forward and think long term, and that's a huge challenge. What does it mean to reconceptualize and rethink security, development, and so on and so forth, and protection, if we think about 20, 30 years down the line, given that obviously if you wage war, you won't be able to solve conflict, won't be able to adapt to conflict or mitigate adapt or mitigate climate effects. So I think that's a huge challenge, and most of what we've done so far, or certainly within the international community, is not ready for that sort of theoretical and conceptual challenge.
And Catherine Loon, to you, can you identify a single action item that you would like to see moved on in order to advance our discussion today?
We need to find ways to bring climate action to conflict-affected communities. I mean, that's a very humanitarian perspective on this question, but what we're seeing is disproportionate impacts of climate risks on conflict-affected communities and hardly any comprehensive response to help these communities. So to us, there's a major gap. So there's a recognition of the challenges that this is creating for communities, but we remain unable to develop something that would be a comprehensive response for these communities. So, I mean, the term climate action encompasses just about everything, so we'd probably need to define it, but we need to be looking into responses that make sense and that integrate long-term projections of risks, because otherwise we are providing very ad hoc responses to something that is a long, sustained problem.
Thank you. And Robert, over to you with a final thought.
Thank you, Mark. I would just say that geographically speaking, the Sahel is already a very complex environment. And then when we bring in all the social, economic, cultural aspect of things that are happening with the different populations there, I think it's just increased the difficult situation of how to interact concretely among the different actors, but also among the populations. So I would just say that it's really important to investigate really in the ground what are the priority factors that need to be understood with the communities, because they are the ones who know exactly what has been working before to avoid conflicts and so on. And then based on that, how can we manage the different resources to avoid this kind of tension, especially in the context of climate variability? So research has to deal with it, but not alone, working with the other actors, NGOs, donors, politicians, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. And finally, to Madame Coty, can you give viewers and listeners an action item or something that you think needs to be done to better integrate climate variability and food system security and into new approaches to security thinking in the region?
Thank you. Well, I think listening to the other panelists, I realized that we all have a role to play in this at different levels, and I think that if we can all contribute to enhance partnerships on all these levels, that will already make us go a step forward. In fact, Norway has already kind of started some of the work that we see will be useful by supporting the UN Department of Political and Peacekeeping Affairs work with UNOVAS and ECOWAS through the climate security mechanism. And they are also cooperating with regional bodies in the Sahel and Lake Chad region. So that is kind of one example of what can be done. We also, of course, cooperate closely with the CGIAR and organizations like the Sahel and West Africa Club, who are also working on, promoting information analysis and trying to make them into policies, or promote the fact that they need to be translated into good policies in the region. So I think that is what would be an important thing for us. And again, when we are in the Security Council, we will, of course, do our best to promote this issue as an important agenda item.
Well, thank you. Thank you to the panelists for this robust conversation today. I think we have good opportunities to advance this conversation forward. And I'm glad, if nothing else, to have introduced you all to each other through this discussion, and we can continue this conversation. I am now going to turn the panel back over to Rachel for some concluding remarks. Thank you all, and much appreciated. And let's keep moving this conversation forward. So over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Mark and panelists. What a fantastic, complex discussion we had there. I see we hear about local levels, we hear about how the Sahel is also this area. It was described as a malleable space for intervention. It would be great if I could have my video back on, organizers. It was a non-governed space. It was seen to be military and an area of conflict. And yet we hear that this is a place where local herders are fighting with farmers, with pastoralists. And the call to action has been that we need to think both short-term, yes, we need to protect people, but we need to have long-term adaptation policies that look at how we can bring in more climate resilient crops, more climate resilient livelihoods. Where are we going to be able to support those people that we would describe that are in extreme poverty? How can we bring development with those immediate needs of assistance? So I think it's wonderful that we've started. There was a lot. We said at the beginning that we wanted to break down silos, and there's an incredible amount of thinking across political science, international thinking here, climate and water science, as well as really understanding the humanitarian complexities in this region. Next time our video is going to be, our seminar series is going to be in Colombia. We're going to go to Latin America. We're going to see again how climate security is really affecting the areas in this country. This will be on the 17th of September, and we really hope you'll be able to join us for that. And to start that, we're now going to show a short video giving you an introduction to the theme of those times. Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you very much, moderator. It's been a fascinating set of discussions and much for us to work on and think about. Thank you.